Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today we're jumping right into a classic ancient text that hits on a universally frustrating human experience, and that is the agonizing trial of waiting. We're going to unpack the incredible narrative of Genesis 16, look at delayed promises, and see what actually happens when we decide the divine just might need a little bit of our human intervention.
So, right off the bat, is it ever okay to help God out? Look, we've all been there, right? You've got a promise, a hope, or a clear direction, but the timing, it just seems hopelessly delayed. When that clock is ticking and heaven seems completely silent, the temptation to take matters into our own hands is literally overwhelming. But as we're going to see, relying on our own fleshly desires instead of resting in a divine promise leads to some pretty complicated deviations in our faith.
Let's start with the crisis of waiting, looking at a really long 10 years in Canaan.
What's absolutely fascinating here is the sheer weight of time. God had promised Abram an heir. Simple enough, right? But a full decade has passed since they arrived in Canaan. Abram is now 85, Sarai is 75, and they have been waiting for 10 long years. You can just imagine the whispers, the creeping doubts, the fading hope. It's right here at the absolute breaking point, year 10, that Sarai, feeling completely restrained from bearing children, gets desperate and suggests an alternative route to build their family.
That brings us to ancient laws and customs, and the historical context of her decision.
Because, Sarai's offer wasn't actually an act of madness. It was a brilliant legal loophole for her time. If we look at the 18th century BC Hammurabi Code, or the ancient Nuzi documents from the 14th and 15th centuries BC, they explicitly outline this exact scenario. If a wife was infertile, it was perfectly legal and totally customary for her to give her maidservant to her husband as a surrogate. The child would literally be recognized as the wife's own. Sarai was just applying the accepted cultural logic of her day to solve a divine problem. She leaned on the law of the land, giving Abram her Egyptian maid, Hagar.
Which leads us straight into the spiritual fallout. What happens when human solutions meet divine problems?
What follows is just the rapid, heartbreaking collapse of their entire household. Abram agrees. He takes Hagar, and she immediately conceives. But instead of joy, it breeds immense pride. She starts looking down on Sarai, and the home becomes completely toxic. Sarai feels wronged, she blames Abram, and then harshly afflicts Hagar until the pregnant maidservant eventually just flees into the harsh wilderness. This is exactly what happens when we try to use fleshly efforts to, quote-unquote, help God. We don't get peace, we get pride, blame, bitter division, and profound relational strife.
Let's pause on a very specific number for a second. 86. Abram was exactly 86 years old when Ishmael was born. Now, why does that matter? Because he was still 14 years short of the century mark, the age of 100 where God's true miracle would eventually happen. 86 represents settling. It's a result born of human effort that falls entirely short of perfect, complete, divine timing.
So now we get into law versus grace, which is essentially a cosmic clash. The Apostle Paul actually uses this exact story in Galatians to explain two totally distinct spiritual identities. On one side, Hagar and Ishmael represent human effort, the flesh, and the law, basically trying to earn God's favor or fulfill his plans using our own strength. Conversely, Sarai and her future son Isaac represent the promise, the spirit, and grace, resting entirely on what God can do. When Abram took Hagar, he was essentially stepping out of grace and trying to operate under the constraints of human effort.
And let's look at the result of that fleshly effort. Ishmael. His name means God hears, but the prophecy about him is honestly kind of startling. He's described as a wild donkey. Spiritually speaking, this perfectly represents the religious effort of the flesh. It's unconstrained, untamed, hostile, and in constant conflict with the spirit. Ishmael's lineage would dwell to the east, becoming this long-term painful consequence for Abram's family, and a perpetual rival to the actual child of the promise.
Let's shift gears to the God who sees, and a beautiful moment of divine compassion.
Pivot your perspective away from Abram for just a second and look at Hagar. She is pregnant, she's alone, marginalized, and suffering by a spring in the wilderness of Shur. And it's at her absolute lowest point that the angel of the Lord actually meets her. It is a stunning picture of divine compassion. God extends immense grace to this lost, suffering servant. He gives her correction, sure, instructing her to return and submit to her mistress, which, by the way, is a beautiful picture of the lost submitting back under grace, but he also gives her a profound promise of care. God doesn't abandon those caught in the crossfire of our faithless mistakes.
And this leads to one of the most beautiful, contemplative moments in the entire text. Hagar becomes the first person in Scripture to actually give God a name. She calls him El Roi, the God who sees. And the well there is named Bir Lahai Roi, which literally translates to the well of the living one who sees me. In that moment, she realizes that even in her lowest state, as a runaway in a barren desert, the divine intimately sees and cares for her. It's truly amazing.
All right, wrapping things up with how we avoid the faith trap and our final takeaways.
So how do we avoid falling into this exact same Abram-style faith trap today? Well, it comes down to recognizing the deviations that happen when we interfere. First, we try to force God's timing just because waiting is so agonizing. Second, we rely on cultural logic, what makes sense to the world around us, over a divine promise. Third, we end up creating these Ishmael works born of our own fleshly hustle. And finally, those works inevitably cause long-lasting relational and spiritual strife. You simply cannot produce a spiritual result with a fleshly method. It doesn't work.
I want to anchor all these ideas with this one thought. The problem is not about bearing fruit, but by whose power, our flesh or God's Spirit, the fruit is born. See, Abram's problem wasn't wanting a son. It was how he went about getting one. True faith doesn't panic. It doesn't rush when the ultimate promise is delayed. It rests completely in the grace of God's timing.
Which brings us to our final question for you to ponder. When the clock is ticking and heaven seems absolutely silent, will you wait for the true promise, or will you settle for a substitute of your own making? Take some time to contemplate where you might be building your own Ishmael today. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep seeking the God who sees you.